If China and the United States went to war over any reason, Taiwan, something to the South China Sea, and the war goes nuclear, would the United States win? Is it even possible to win a nuclear war? And what are the opportunities and the possibilities of there being a war at all, whether a conventional or nuclear, between the United States and China? Is one inevitable? These are some of the really, really important questions that we need to ask and get some answers to, because while a lot of the world is focused on, for understandably, on the Russia-Ukraine war, which is ongoing, or the explosive Middle East, which seems to always be on a hair's edge from turning into itself a big regional conflict. This one, possibilities here in the Indo-Pacific have just enormous implications for global security and U.S. national security, et cetera. So we thought it was important to take a look at that today, especially given some recent comments and some reports that have come out. And to discuss this, we have an exceptional view today. We have a panel here. We have first former Ambassador Chaz Freeman, who used to be an ambassador to Saudi Arabia, but was also the charge d'affaires in the DCM in the Beijing embassy in 1981-84. As well as many other senior posts that he's had. And we have Lyle Goldstein, who is the Asia director director of Asia engagement for Defense Priorities, where I also work. So, gentlemen, grateful to have you back on with us today.
Happy to be here.
Yeah, likewise.
Well, listen, this is kind of an important issue here, and it's kind of been on the back burner. At least it's on the stove, but it's been on the back burner, I think, because of all these other issues going on here. But I know that issues related to U.S. and China and Indo-Pacific security is really important to both of y'all. And Mr. Ambassador, I just wanted to start with you first. Why do you think it's important for us to pay more attention to this than maybe we have been?
Well, first of all, we had an official realization, which we expressed in a solemn international statement, that a nuclear war can never be won and should never be fought. And yet the new Biden-produced nuclear doctrine is aimed at enabling the United States to wage and win a nuclear war, not just against Russia or China, but also against North Korea, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, and any other foe who develops nuclear weapons. The problem of a war with China is that at this point, it's very uncertain whether we could prevail in a conventional war. Any escalation to the nuclear level, which the Chinese are preparing to deter by building a vastly greater retaliatory capability out in the Gobi Desert, would result in a nuclear exchange, which could not just end life in the United States and China, but on the entire planet. So this is no joke. And yet the nuclear allergy in the United States appears to have badly eroded. We have people talking about developing tactical nuclear weapons for use on the battlefield again, as sort of thing we were talking about in the 1950s. And we are modernizing our nuclear force with new fuses that will double their capacity to conduct a preemptive nuclear first strike on missiles in silos in both Russia and China.
Lyle, I want to bring you in because you actually just published a piece in the Washington Times a week or so ago where you're saying, hey, the U.S. is right to question whether we would come to Taiwan's defense, because there's certainly many in the United States that absolutely think we could, and we should get rid of strategic ambiguity in deference to strategic clarity of saying we would do that. We'll discuss that here a little bit more. But on the issues there that Ambassador Freeman just mentioned here, what do you see, because of your experience in dealing with Chinese, what do they do when they hear these kinds of things? Like they see this announcement of this new fuses, of this document that seems to focus on trying to win a nuclear engagement. How does China react when they see this? Are they deterred, or do they have a different reaction?
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you so much for having me, Danny. It's such an honor to appear with here with Ambassador Freeman and yourself, two people who I admire very intensely. Well, I was in China quite recently, also last year, and gave a lecture at Tsinghua University, which is one of China's leading universities, and in the room were gathered some of their leading experts on nuclear strategy, actually, and we talked this over, and I was shocked to learn that when I said, my sense is that the Chinese side now is seriously studying the issue of limited nuclear war and what that would involve, and they shook their heads in agreement and said, yes, we are studying that. And I was really shocked, because I never experienced anything like that in China before. Usually they just insist they have a minimal deterrent and no interest at all in these ideas. And they said, we're studying it very carefully because we know you're studying it, so that's where things are at. And both sides are making these calculations. I mean, of course, China, probably your listeners all know that China is rapidly building up its nuclear forces. I mean, they're still far from what we have, but that it's very clear to me that their general intent is to sort of duplicate what Putin has done with Russia. I mean, it was always the case since the 1970s that Soviets had a huge nuclear arsenal, but the idea is to deter the United States and to say to the U.S. basically, you don't want to go there. And that's exactly the message I think that China is trying to deliver. And they are indeed the report that Ambassador Freeman just referenced. There was a Sanger article in the New York Times, part of that disturbing article, which talked about the Biden administration's readjustment of U.S. nuclear plans to deal with simultaneous nuclear war with all these powers. But it also said there that China is putting, basically deploying weapons into these new silos at a more rapid clip than had been previously expected. So this nuclear rivalry is taking off. All kinds of crazy ideas are being batted around Washington, as Ambassador Freeman said. It's very disturbing, and we have to nip this in the bud. That's my view, and just say we will not fight a nuclear war with China, certainly not over Taiwan.
And Mr. Ambassador, I know you've got a lot of context to be able to see any evolving or changing Chinese attitudes over time, because I know you were involved in the 1972 opening of China. You were, as I understood, you were a translator actually for the Nixon team that was going on there, and talked to a lot of these people. Over the time, have you seen a shift in Chinese views towards nuclear weapons? And how would you characterize it today as, say, 10, 15 years ago?
Well, there's been a steady evolution. Let's remember that the Chinese nuclear program was developed in response to at least three, which we can count on our side, 6, the Chinese claim, direct threats from the United States to use nuclear weapons against China, starting in the Korean War, going through the various offshore island crises of the 1950s, and continuing into the 1960s. The Chinese nuclear program was conceived as a deterrent. The Chinese also had a doctrine, very clear, no first use of nuclear weapons. In other words, their nuclear weapons were purely a deterrent. We have always reserved the right to do what we did at the end of World War II, namely to use nuclear weapons against a non-nuclear state. The Chinese have never asserted that policy. Going along, there was an agreement on de-targeting. Both sides agreed. Neither side would target the other. That's obviously gone by the boards, because the main purpose of the reformulated Biden nuclear doctrine is China. And we reserve the right to use nuclear weapons preemptively in a first strike, which is not very reassuring. There has been no arms control during all this period with the Chinese. Arms control is a useful means of threat reduction and threat management. It has not been practiced with China, in part because of the fact that the Chinese policies were so different from ours. They already had a commitment, and they deployed their forces in a manner consistent with it, not to use nuclear weapons first, whereas we insert the right to use them when we want. So there was no basis for arms control discussions with the Chinese. But in the broader context, we've given up on arms control. We're not pursuing it with the Russians. We have abandoned it as a means of controlling that relationship. And of course, apparently not content with having driven Russia and China to develop huge nuclear arsenals, we've now pushed North Korea into reliance on a nuclear deterrent against our constant threats.
It's interesting that you say that, we've abandoned any kind of arms control talks with the Russians, and we haven't even engaged any with the Chinese side. And as we're going to see here in a minute, there's the Center for New American Security, CNAS, actually came out with some results of some war games they had, which we're going to talk about in some detail here in a minute. But it's advocating the exact opposite. Instead of talking about threat reduction, let's talk about managing nuclear escalation, which I find very, very alarming. We'll get into that here in a minute. But first of all, Lyle, I want to get to something you raised in your article there in the Washington Times piece by looking at something that some people have been saying, because you have a lot of people saying that we need to be ready for more action with China, not that we need to see about de-escalating, and whether Biden means what he has said when he said we're going to fight for Taiwan against China. We'll also see that here in a second. But first of all, I want to look at one of the guys who's one of the bigger hawks against China, and that's Gordon Chang. Here he was, I believe, earlier this summer, saying something that he says a lot, and that a lot of people agree with here, that lots of flashpoints in the Indo-Pacific, not just the China-Taiwan issue. Watch this.
Gordon, do you think the Chinese see the inevitability of a Trump presidency, and that they are doing things like positioning troops in Belarus, moving their carriers in the Taiwan Straits, in the Philippines? Do you think they're doing that as a way to stage themselves for negotiating points against perhaps a more stronger president?
Well, yeah, and they certainly see a closing window of opportunity, which closes on January 20, 2025. And so right now, at this moment, we don't have to speculate, because China is engaging in extremely belligerent activities at Second Thomas Shoal and other features in the South China Sea. And those are flashpoints which could very well lead to war.
So according to Gordon Chang and all those who follow his view, Lyle, China is the one who is pushing for war with all of these actions. How do you see that part?
Well, look, I mean, the first thing to do, I think, and I've met Gordon Chang, and he has his view. We've had a bit of debate. I would love to debate him in the future, because I think he's dead wrong, pretty much across the board. Since I think it was he who predicted the collapse of China not long ago. In general, I mean, I think we have to start with some simple basics at the outset here of a discussion about China. And I think we should start looking at a map, and when you look at that map, you see that all these disputes, whether it's in the South China Sea or more particularly with respect to Taiwan, this is right up against the China coast. In the case of Taiwan, they consider that a province of China. And I think, Americans would be wise to ask these basic questions. Say, if this was going on right off the U.S. coast, or indeed was impacting a territory we consider to be ours, that this behavior would be, just think of U.S. actions in the Cuban Missile Crisis, for example. So it's not strange at all to see a great power react or to bristle and flex its muscles in its own neighborhood, and in that way, there is some echo with the Ukraine war currently underway. To me, this is normal behavior of great powers and consistent with China's actions generally. But let's keep in mind, China has not resorted to a major use of force since 1979. So I think if you look across the board and put all the great powers up against each other and look at their list of armed conflict, that there's no question that China generally is acting with a lot of restraint. And I think part of it is they just prefer to focus on economic development and make a lot of money and spread their influence that way. And that is, they're quite content with that approach. But there are some exceptions here. And Taiwan is a huge, flashing exception. But the South China Sea is also an area where they're quite tender. After all, a lot of their crucial sea lanes pass through that area. So I don't think it's surprising at all, and I would not term it as aggression either.
Can I?
Yeah, go ahead. Sure.
Let me just add something. I think Gordon Chang has made a career of belligerence against China. For 30 years, he's been predicting its imminent collapse. It hasn't happened. I think his description of what is happening in the South China Sea has to be taken with a very large grain of salt. His principal qualification as an expert on China is that he's ethnically Chinese. Well, that's not much of a qualification at all. So let me just make a few points. We are in China's face, as Lyle said. We are all along its coast. We run 3 to 4 intrusive patrols along that coast every day. We contest Chinese presence in the South China Sea. We have adopted the claims of others as our own. We have no claims of our own in the region. And to just clarify Lyle's point about 2/3 of the ship traffic through the South China Sea is en route to or from China or carried on Chinese bottoms. There is no one who has a bigger stake in freedom of navigation in the South China Sea than China. And who might disrupt that? Well, the U.S. Navy plans to do so in the event of a Taiwan contingency. So the Chinese, I think, we're caught in a feedback loop. This is a classic security dilemma. They're doing things they consider defensive. We consider them aggressive or offensive, and vice versa. And we're not talking to the Chinese. So all this is going on autopilot with no adult supervision, at least on our side.
Well, it's interesting you talk about the reaction to folks have. One is offensive, one is defensive, one says freedom of navigation, one says the other. We had earlier this summer, I think it's just not too long ago. There was, I think it was a joint Russia-Chinese patrol that was near some of the Aleutian Islands, outside of United States, and a lot of anxiety about that. And on Fox News, they were like some outrage that how dare China get near any Alaska islands. And so they brought on Representative Gallagher to give his view on that. And well, watch how that went.
It seems obvious to me that Xi Jinping is preparing his country for war. He would prefer to take Taiwan without having to fire a shot or resort to war. But he's repeatedly told us he intends to take Taiwan by force if necessary. And he's probing with bayonets. If he finds steel, he'll stop. But if he finds mush, he's going to continue to push. That's how Marxist-Leninist regimes operate.
Mr. Ambassador, is that how Marxist-Leninists operate? That they're probing with a bayonet, just looking for any opportunity to go to war?
I think it's utter nonsense, frankly. It's got nothing to do with Marxism, Leninism. Leninism is alive in China, but Marxism is on life support if it hasn't already expired. But the main point is this is an issue for Chinese nationalism. Why? Because Taiwan symbolizes the failure of the revolution, both revolutions, 1911, the Kuomintang Revolution, and the Communist Revolution in 1949, to achieve the unification of China, to remove foreign spheres of influence, like that in Taiwan of the United States, from Chinese territory, to complete the subordination of provincial level officials to the central government. And this is what it's about. It's not about ideology. Basically, the Chinese long ago offered to let Taiwan preserve both its socioeconomic system completely and its political system. I mean, Taiwan is a robust democracy. It is admirable in many ways. Is that a reason for the United States to defend it? Well, that's a question. Are we going to risk nuclear war with China in order to preserve an ideological bastion? Is Taiwan vital to our national interests? So much so that we contest the territorial limits of a nuclear superpower? We never did that, by the way, with the Russians. We did not accept their inclusion of the Baltic states, but we never attempted to defend them against the Soviet Union or detach them from the Soviet Union. We're talking about dismembering an entity called China that we have recognized includes Taiwan, even though it's not under the People's Republic of China's jurisdiction, in our view. So this is very complicated. And I want to make a final point. I can see Lyle is getting into the blocks and about to launch forward in a sprint. But I want to make a fundamental point here, and that is for 30 years, we recognized that the government of China was in Taipei, not in Beijing. And it was not a government in exile because it was on Chinese soil. Now we've decided we're not so sure about that. When we normalized relations with Beijing, began the process in 1972. We concluded it in the end of 1978, and we abandoned our defense commitment to Taiwan. And we replaced it with an arms sales policy that would allow Taiwan to defend itself while it reached an accommodation with the Chinese across the strait. Peaceful resolution of this issue through negotiations. Somehow, that abandonment of a defense commitment, which was confirmed by the Taiwan Relations Act, where we undertook to provide weapons and maintain a capacity to intervene if necessary, but made no commitment to defend Taiwan. Somehow that has all gone by the board. The president, without any constitutional authority whatsoever, has reasserted a treaty-like commitment to defend Taiwan on 4 occasions. That is a violation not only of the Constitution, but of the Taiwan Relations Act. And by the way, I'll just finish up. I'm a veteran of war in the Middle East. We did not need a treaty with Kuwait to come to its rescue when Iraq tried to annex it. We did not need a treaty with anyone to go into Iraq. It was a foolish thing to do in 2003, but we did it. We have the ability to act in pursuit of our own interests when that is required. What exactly are our interests in Taiwan? That is a question that needs to be addressed.
It does. And Lyle, if you have something to say, I want to jump into that. But I did want you to at least include one specific thing, because you mentioned you have recently been in China and talked to some of these folks here. How do they view these, what we call freedom of navigation operations, where we continue to sail near Chinese territory and go through the straits, et cetera?
Yeah, let me come to freedom of navigation in a minute. I worked for the Navy for 20 years, so I got my ear full of freedom of navigation.
Nice.
But I did just want to comment. I mean, first of all, everything Gaz just said, I would underline it 2 or 3 times. He is the nation's expert on these matters, and we better listen really carefully to everything he has to say, as I have through my career. One more thing I'd just add on Taiwan, and there's a lot to say on Taiwan, of course, but I don't think most Americans realize that the constitutional title of this island is, this entity is the Republic of China, not the Republic of Taiwan. And that's critically important to understand. And once Americans grapple with the fact that they're contemplating going to war for the Republic of China, against the People's Republic of China, I think that it will become, in flashing light, that kind of moment of clarity that we are hell-bent, it seems, on re-entering a civil war, which Nixon and Kissinger tried to extract us out of. I think we've had plenty of experience with Asian civil wars, Afghanistan, Iraq, Vietnam. The list is very long at this point. So let's, I think once Americans kind of clue into that fully, that they will realize what a huge mistake it would be to try to do this. One point on the Aleutians, I would just say too, is, yes, I think if you look at a map again and you see the Aleutians, how far they go into the North Pacific, that it is kind of insane, an insane double standard that we get pretty ticked off when China sorties its ships and aircraft, and probably in the future surveillance robots and so forth into these areas. And by the way, if we continue along this path of this new Cold War, there will be much more of that, and they will be off the California coast and be off the East Coast. Those, I assure you that those, those operations are in the planning stages in China. They can't do it yet, but they will do that. They will come to our front door, and we will not like it at all. On freedom of navigation, I mean that's quite related point here that for a long time that we have insisted that is what we're doing. But as Ambassador Freeman laid out, I mean, there's really no evidence of China getting in the way of freedom of navigation. All of the commerce that crosses the South China Sea really is, the vast majority is going to and from, Chinese ports to other destinations. So they don't have any interest in that. What we do see is them interfering on a very specific set of issues related to basically related to fisheries. That's a big deal, and to prospecting, for oil and gas and that kind of related activity. I don't think Americans want to go to war for those issues. This issue with the Philippines, it is quite complex. But honestly, again, let's get back to basics. Do Americans seriously want to contemplate war with another nuclear superpower over rocks and reefs? Again, common sense answer is no. Let's let the diplomats do their thing and figure this one out at some kind of compromise. And I do think that there are compromises to be had. After all, China says that its approach in the South China Sea, it wants to do joint development. And I think somehow it manages to get along with Malaysia, with Vietnam, Indonesia, these other countries. So I think this is manageable if Manila is smart on these issues.
Well, with diplomacy for sure. One thing I want to discuss a little bit more, because it's been mentioned a couple of times already, and that is the one China policy that the United States has officially held for quite a number of years. And then the question of that Ambassador Freeman also touched on a second ago, would the U.S. defend Taiwan? So first of all, I want to look at the words that the U.S. is saying. This is very recently from Jake Sullivan, National Security Advisor, laying out a pretty common sense view. Here's what he said.
China believes that the continued U.S. arms sales to Taiwan and other actions have increased tensions in the Taiwan Strait. So how do you respond to this, and what is the U.S. willing to do to de-escalate? Thank you.
Our one China policy has not changed, and our approach to this issue is guided by the one China policy, the Taiwan Relations Act, the 3 joint communiques, and the 6 assurances. That remains true today. And that has remained true on a bipartisan basis through multiple administrations. And that policy has actually helped contribute to maintaining peace and stability across the Taiwan Strait for decades, and we intend to keep it that way.
Now, Mr. Ambassador, you were actually part of the U.S. that actually helped negotiate a lot of those things that he mentioned in there. So those words, as I understand, you would probably say, yeah, those are the right words, but do our actions line up with them?
No, they don't. They used to, perhaps, to some extent. The one China principle, if you will, was not invented by us. It was invented by Chiang Kai-shek. He insisted there could only be one China, that he should control it. We recognized him as the legal government of China. And so in 1971-72, when we pursued an opening with China to balance the threat of the Soviet Union, we were able to say that all Chinese on either side of the Taiwan Strait maintain there's only one China, and that Taiwan is part of China. And we said, we don't challenge that position. Well, now we apparently do in practice, although we play verbal games and claim that nothing has changed. We did do an agreement with the Chinese in 1982, an arms control agreement to limit our supply of weapons to Taiwan, to be commensurate with the threat of the use of force. It was not until we violated that commitment that China began the military buildup it has been engaged in since basically 1999, which has culminated in its development of military capabilities that in many respects, as Lyle can attest, now outmatch our own. And I would say, finally, with regard to the Philippines and others, first of all, there is no problem. The Chinese and the Vietnamese appear to get along fine despite their historic enmity. Chinese get along well with Malaysia, which has endorsed reunification for Taiwan with the mainland. They get along well with Brunei, which is another potential claimant. They have a problem with the Philippines. Why is that? And it seems to be related to the fact that the United States is using the dispute between the Philippines and China to reestablish bases in the Philippines from which to strike China in the event of a war over Taiwan. And we appear to be encouraging the Filipinos to take a tough line militarily on the South China Sea territorial disputes rather than to pursue a negotiated solution. And here, let me say, fisheries is which I think Lyle mentioned, is a very, very important issue to all of the littoral states, Vietnam, China, Philippines, Malaysia, and so on. There is a basis, if anyone cared to try it, if we were not so bellicose in our approach to this, for composing something like the Arctic Council, a council of the littoral states in the region to jointly manage fisheries. It is arguable the only reason China has by default taken on that role is because there is no such dialogue in the region. We keep inserting ourselves. We have nothing to add on that. So I'd say step back and let the people in the region sort out their own problems, which indeed they are quite capable of doing.
Oh, no. I'm sorry. We can't do that. I don't know if you saw, but the president said we're the indispensable nation and we shape events. We don't let them happen. We have to lead the world, and the world is, I'm sorry.
How well are we shaping events? Are we shaping them toward peace and prosperity for the United States or toward increased danger of nuclear war, not just with China, but with Russia and with North Korea? If we're going to shape events, let's do it right, not wrong.
Right. Couldn't agree with you more. And in fact, kind of going down that rabbit hole a little bit of areas of concern. Lyle, one of the things, and I'm going to get to this in a second, that you were talking about in a recent Defense Priorities publication, is that, asking some of these questions. Should we be involved in a war for Taiwan? Can we be involved? And I'm going to get to some of the things that were in that in a second. But first of all, I want to get to something that also Ambassador Freeman referenced earlier, and that is President Biden has on numerous occasions actually said we would defend Taiwan. I want to, first of all, play this from actually in 2022 where some of this was being addressed so you can see exactly what we're talking about.
Last night on CBS's 60 Minutes, Biden took his pledge to defend the island one step further. Take a listen.
To be clear, sir, U.S. forces, U.S. men and women would defend Taiwan in the event of a Chinese invasion.
Yes.
When asked over and over whether the United States military would defend Taiwan in the event of an invasion by China, President Biden has said now several times categorically, yes, they would. Now, the last time he was asked about this, when he was on that overseas trip, he was asked specifically, would the U.S. military do more than they have done in Ukraine? And he said yes. Why that's so important, Morgan, is that proves that when talking about the act of defending Taiwan, President Biden is not just talking about providing them with equipment or weapons or intelligence sharing or any kind of support, that he's talking about going a step further than that. The implication that most people take from that is that would involve actual U.S. military involvement, U.S. military action.
Now, we have the one China policy, and you saw Jake Sullivan talking about it a second ago, but then you see the president has said this kind of thing. And as far as I've seen, I've never seen the president himself refute these kinds of things. So how does this play into the potential for clashes in the South China Sea or with the United States and China, whether it's Taiwan or something else? What is the prospect that we could actually get involved with this conflict?
Well, it's very provocative. It's way out in front of the Taiwan Relations Act. It's unconstitutional. The president does not have the authority to make defense commitments of that nature under the Constitution. That is a power reserved to Congress. The fact that Congress chooses to default on its responsibilities under the Constitution is another very disturbing matter, but does not give the president the authority to commit the United States in that manner. And because it is provocative, it is the primary driver of the Chinese military buildup against Taiwan. And the problem now is that there is no apparent path to a peaceful resolution of this issue. There was, but now there is not. And the Taiwanese side has abandoned its adherence to the one China principle and policy. And we have a president in Taipei now who asserts that Taiwan's already independent. And here I want to refer again to something that you mentioned, Danny, and that is that the world recognizes the island of Taiwan as the seat of the Republic of China. That entity now has 12 countries that recognize it and maintain normal, full diplomatic relations with it. All of them recognize it as China, the government of China. As Lyle said, none of them recognize it as Taiwan, or the Republic of, there's no Republic of Taiwan. There was once in about 1895, but that was a long time ago.
That was a long time ago. And I want to go down that a little bit further, Lyle. This is something I'm showing here on my screen that you said here, or what defense priorities published here was, would the U.S. really fight for Taiwan? Okay, we saw that's what President Biden has said in the past. But you asked a couple of questions on here, or the authors of this piece did. I just want to go over a couple of them. It said, how could U.S. forces prevail when China's large armed forces are so proximate and prepare for this fight, while our forces are on the end of a logistics train that stretches 10,000 miles across the Pacific? I think that's a really important point to point out. And how do you answer that question?
Yeah, and that's why I think that the president either willfully or not is engaged in an elaborate kind of bluff, as are many in Washington, because anybody who really takes a look at the military details here sees quite immediately. After all, just pull out a map and you see the tremendous kind of asymmetry here, that geography grants a huge advantage to the Chinese armed forces in this scenario. I mean, in a way, it's a kind of dream scenario for them. And that's what's so scary about this. I mean, we could blunder into a kind of Tsushima Strait, if people know their history, type disaster where our fleet losses are, truly devastating, of the type that is the end of a superpower. So, we just don't want to go there. And not only are the Chinese proximate, but they're prepared and focused, meaning they have focused singularly on this scenario for at least 3 decades, but really for more, and prepared in each and every way for each contingency. Now, I want to say that China does not want to fight a war with the U.S. That's absolutely clear. And they, I think, will do their utmost to persuade those few smart people in D.C. to realize that this is not worth doing. And that's one reason they're building up their nuclear forces so robustly, because Americans might be wise enough to stand aside. I suspect they will be wise enough. However, they're not counting on that, and they are indeed prepared to go there. And I'm more and more convinced that they have done the homework. They're dotting the I's and crossing the T's. And I do believe, although surely if it came to war, we would inflict huge losses on the Chinese, I'm quite convinced they would prevail, actually. And a lot of this has to do with logistics, which I know, Danny, you know a lot about. But keeping those ships, for example, supplied with gas and munitions, and these are not small munitions. We're not moving 155 rounds around. We're moving torpedoes, which are very dear, very costly, very hard to move around, and very hard to put in a warship, including a submarine. So these are tremendously vulnerable logistics nodes. The Chinese are well aware of that, and this is a fight we should not enter into this fight. We are so severely disadvantaged that if it comes to a war with China, and I dearly hope it does not, but this is the wrong place for such a war.
And Mr. Ambassador, one of the other things you've seen from over the last year or so, especially from a whole list of U.S. admirals in congressional testimonies that they continue to talk about this big risk of China, and to try to alleviate some of these things, they want multiple $1 billion of additional defense spending in order to create more and more bases and other kinds of things around the Taiwan Strait area. Is this a good path for the United States? Is this going to make us more safe, and will it deter China?
No to all of those questions. It's not a good course. It's natural for bureaucratic entities like military services to want more money, and threat exaggeration is the basic way to achieve that. But they have a responsibility to do what the National Command Authority, the president, directs them to do. The president, whether he has constitutional authority or not, has told them to prepare to enter a war with China over Taiwan, so they have to plan for that. That's not their fault. I think, however, I want to make a few points. First of all, one thing the Ukraine war has shown us, by the way, it's a proxy war with Russia. We don't have our own troops directly involved in the fighting. They're behind the Ukrainians, but they're not on the front line. This would not be a proxy war. This is a direct war. It's far easier to finesse the nuclear matter if it's a proxy war than it is if you're directly attacking the Chinese homeland, which we would do. Chinese military doctrine, as Lyle knows, is if you strike me, I will strike you. So we attack their homeland, they will attack ours by whatever means they consider appropriate. It could be just a cyber attack, but we're risking nuclear war with a nuclear power over this issue. And I think the other point is that another thing the Ukraine war has shown us is that we don't have the surge capacity we did in World War II. We are not the arsenal of democracy in the 21st century. Whether we have a democracy or not is increasingly debatable.
Right.
But leave that aside. We are spending, if you put, the defense budget is only about 60% of what we spend on military matters. And so we're spending well over $1 trillion on the military, maybe $1.5 trillion. The Chinese are spending far less. The burden on their economy is far less, and they do have surge capacity. They have the ability to win a war of attrition, which is what this could easily turn into.
So crucial to understand, yeah.
Wow.
Could I just interject one,
Yeah.
data point, which I think people should be aware of? CSIS, the one of the leading think tanks in DC, and not known for their, they generally have supported this policy of preparing for war with China, but they came out with a study a couple of months ago. They said that actually China has something like 230 times the shipbuilding capacity of the United States, not 23 times, which would be already a huge disadvantage, 230 times. And that directly checks out with my experience, spending a lot of time. I was just in Shanghai, but I have walked Chinese shipyards, and it is truly astounding what they're doing. But here, Ambassador Freeman is completely right that if it comes to a war that lasts more than a month, which it may very well shake out that way, it could go on for years. And China is prepared to lose its navy and build another 2 or 3 navies. We cannot do that. If we lose...
and listen, I just want to highlight that point, that it's how crucial it is to understand that. I mean, you're seeing that the Russia-Ukraine war has basically divulged into an attrition model warfare, where it almost doesn't even matter hardly what your tactics are. It matters who's got the biggest industrial capacity, who's got the ability to sustain industrial capacity, and especially arms, and the side that doesn't. And right now, Russia is slowly grinding down. But I think
one more data point
out, it's much bigger on the China-U.S. imbalance.
Yes. And in fact, people don't realize if China put its industrial engine really to work for Russia, then the war would be over very quickly. And China has exercised restraint and not done that, which is very important for us to realize that. But one more data point on shipbuilding, I would say it's often said, I think, and quite right, that China has more shipbuilding capacity in Shanghai, just in Shanghai, than in the entirety of the United States.
Can I let me put this in a broader perspective, because what causes you to lose on the battlefield or at the negotiating table is hubris, overestimation of your own capabilities and capacities. We say, well, we have a bigger economy than China. Well, we do, if you're counting insurance brokers, tax lawyers, and so forth and so on. Chinese manufacturing sector is 3 times our size. It is now 36% of global manufacturing. We have fallen to about 12%. If you get into a war, I'm sorry, insurance brokers are not terribly relevant. And so I think, we have a health sector that eats up about 18, 19% of GDP and still doesn't cover all Americans. And is widely regarded by virtually everybody as a giant ripoff. This is, okay. So we have a bigger GDP, so measured in dollars. Actually, measured in purchasing power, they're 1/3 larger than us.
Oh, wow.
So we need to knock it off. We need to recognize that, we are a formidable country with huge advantages if we have the policies that leverage those characteristics, but we're not doing it.
Yeah. And in fact, I want to actually transition into another thing here in the last segment we have. And all the things that we just got through talking about are on the operational and the tactical level. But there's also the potential for strategic escalation. And I know, Lyle, you talked about this in your somewhat in your Washington Times piece there. But I want to go to a section here on the Center for National New American Security, the CNAS. They just did a projected escalation management, what they call in a protracted war. So they did some analysis on what would happen if the U.S. got into a war with China over whatever reason, China, Taiwan, something, anything else. And the war that went beyond 45 days. Some of the CSIS and some other things have been looking at really the first 30 days. This one said we're going to start with the 45th day, and they're going to say it goes into the nuclear realm. And in fact, one of the findings it says is the findings reflect the fundamental differences of deterrence in the emerging Indo-Pacific area, where distinct geography, targets, and capabilities make limited nuclear escalation potentially more tolerable than in the Cold War era. And Mr. Ambassador, you said a minute ago that the United States needs to start worrying about how to have diplomacy to get and nuclear limitation agreements, again, get that back on the front burner. This CNAS thing is basically arguing the opposite direction. We need to start spending more time figuring out how we can manage the escalation and possibly win a nuclear war. What do you think about that?
I think threat management, threat reduction is a lot better than threat activation, which is what they're talking about. And I think they're nuts. I think we're talking about striking a war in the Chinese homeland. And the idea that somehow this could be a limited war, like the Korean War, the Vietnam War, or for that matter, up to now, the Ukraine War, is just crazy. If you hit the homeland of your nuclear armed enemy, you can be damn sure you're going to be hit back. So there is no distinction between tactical and strategic nuclear weapons in this theater. And to imagine there is insane.
And Lyle, I want to ask you on this next part, Gary, if you could bring up that second quote from the article there. It says the CNAS war game highlighted major divergencies of opinion on nuclear retaliation that will likely challenge U.S. decision makers, and that it may result in capitulation compromises or ineffective counter-coercion approaches. And one of the things that they're arguing is that we need to fix that, and we need to understand how to manage going from the conventional to the nuclear. What do you think about that? Because I know you mentioned some of that in your Washington Times piece.
Well, yeah, I mean, I actually did my PhD in nuclear strategy, and so I've been following this debate closely. And honestly, this was a pretty sleepy area of U.S.-China relations until I think just a couple of years ago. I mean, well, once China started building up a lot, but there are some really disturbing ideas now bumping around Washington. There were 2 reports by the Atlantic Council, which basically seem to argue the same sense of this CNAS report, although I have to study the CNAS report. But basically, they're saying, there are some pretty juicy targets out there for U.S. Tactical nuclear weapons. Possibly the so-called Slickum-N, submarine-launched cruise missile with a nuclear warhead. And by the way, our forces have been equipped recently with low-yield warheads. So this suggests that we are contemplating this, and I have to suspect that this new update reported in that Sanger article last week may have been some codification of these new set of options. This is extremely disturbing, and I think I generally agree with Ambassador Freeman's take. Look, if we go there, if we really consider these options, then it's very likely that we will lose Guam, that Sasebo Harbor might get struck by a nuclear weapon, that Alaska, would be on the target list, Hawaii as well. I mean, and it goes up from there. And let's remember that book 2034 by Admiral Stavridis that came out a few years ago ended with the exchange of cities. So it may not be the end of the planet. I guess we can hope the planet would survive, and our country might even survive. But we would, we might lose, as in that book. I think San Diego was lost. Imagine that, folks. So here's where we go from losing tens of thousands of sailors in a localized strait crisis, and now we are losing millions of Americans and have whole parts of our country completely devastated. And, yes, I believe Ambassador Freeman is entirely correct that China would, escalate pretty quickly to these kind of probably counter-value strikes against targets like Honolulu.
Yeah. So Gary, bring up that third one there, because this is one of the more troubling, maybe the most troubling of all this that I said, because they're talking about their findings that the United States lacks a doctrine and capabilities. So we need to force that or focus on that. So their recommendations are to fully integrate nuclear activities into the U.S. planning exercise, not just as a last day or standalone exercise. Reviving the skill for great power competition and potential U.S. PRC conflict generates a powerful signal that the U.S. forces are alert to the threat of nuclear escalation and lessens the operational advantages that an adversary may seek to gain through limited nuclear use. So he is outright suggesting that, hey, we need to figure out how, elsewhere they say, to manage the the crossfade, I think is the term they use in there. So it should be part of our planning to plan for and do exercises for going from conventional to nuclear, and thinking that we can manage that somehow.
So can I make one more point here?
Sure.
I think what these Washington strategists don't seem to get or don't want to admit is that that step of nuclear escalation is just a proxy for interests. That is, how much are you willing to risk? How much are you willing to pay? Are you willing to lose cities over this? Huge naval armadas and so forth. And I don't doubt that China has the advantage when it comes to national interest in this, and that's what they're relying upon. And it's quite a strong. That's the same thing that Putin is relying on. He cares about Ukraine much more than Americans do, and there's just no defying that principle. So if we're talking about core interests, the side that has the more obvious interests will prevail in a nuclear showdown. I have no doubt about that.
That is called the balance of fervor, and it favors the Chinese.
Absolutely.
I want to make a number of points. If a Russian sub or a Chinese sub fired a tactical nuclear weapon at the city of Houston, would we regard that as a tactical nuclear weapon, or would we see it as comparable to an ICBM fired at Houston from across the ocean? I think the answer is obvious. Would we not retaliate? We would. We're talking about a war in China, and against Chinese forces on their home territory. And you think that somehow won't lead to their striking back? Finally, I just note that because the war is in China, the country with the biggest interest in avoiding escalation to the nuclear level is China. And we are the ones who propose first use, and these doctrines that CNES is trying to develop suggest that it be integrated into our regular planning We are the ones who propose to initiate a nuclear exchange. Do we know where that will end up in terms of how many dead Americans there will be? We should think about this.
Yeah, that point really needs to be emphasized, is that I think China's approach here is that they do not want this war to go nuclear. They don't want war, period, with the United States, but and therefore they are really doubling down on their no first use. And you can see that in all their rhetoric. In fact, they've made another outreach to Washington, quite unusual, where they said, let's talk about no first use much more. And even the New York Times, I think, which is fairly hawkish these days, but even them came around to saying, actually, we should talk about this with China, that a no first use might make sense, and try to put these, let's say, put all these ideas from CNAS and the Atlantic Council, put them back in Pandora's box, because that's where they belong.
And Mr. Ambassador, I mean, they have a no first use, at least desire, of course. But when they see things like this, advocating that the U.S. actually put into normal planning the thought that we'll transition and have this crossfade into nuclear weapons as a normal means of fighting, as a deterrence. How much of a deterrence does that produce in China, or how much of an incentive does it produce for them to go the opposite direction?
I think the incentives are the other way. Fortunately, so far, the Chinese seem to have continued to insist on no first use. As Lyle mentioned, they're trying to negotiate that with us and others. They condemned, by the way, Putin's threats of nuclear use in Ukraine, or the implied threat of a revised Russian nuclear doctrine. They condemned that. They said there should not be any first use under any circumstances. And, you know, there's a long history here. Their forces were configured for no first use. They are now beginning to achieve a launch on warning capability, which is the instant response to a perceived nuclear attack. And this means that if the United States gets into a war with the Chinese, and we attack a Chinese base where nuclear weapons are stored, they may see that as the equivalent of a nuclear attack. They cannot distinguish a missile with a nuclear warhead from one that doesn't have one. And so we're entering an area that is extremely dangerous. And finally, I will just note that with regard to escalation control, there is no mechanism for escalation control that has been agreed between the United States and China. There is no effective military-to-military dialogue. We're talking past each other. We trade talking points. We don't listen to each other. So this is very ineffective. And we used to talk to the Russians at the height of the Cold War, the Soviets. We don't talk to the Chinese. But we're risking a war with them that could destroy our country as well as theirs.
Right. And so let me follow that up, Lyle. What should so we have CNAS saying what they think that we should do, escalate the training so that we actually do crossfade, whatever. What do you think the United States should do? What is in America's national interest that promotes our security and our economic prosperity into the future? What should we do?
Yeah, well, I think we should put aside this kind of hubris and arrogance, and we should, I believe, embrace the idea of a multipolar world, and that it's not polite to say, but that involves, essentially granting the fact that other great powers have a prerogative in their kind of spheres of influence. That's kind of the reality, and most realists will agree on that point. And for Taiwan, of course, that means that Taiwan is going to have to make some compromises. That's just, and I think an objective reading of history and geography and the balance of power yields that Taiwan has to be a part of a compromise. I believe that if we, held by our agreements, that is the One China policy and also the 1982 communique, where we were generally reducing our involvement, that Taipei and Beijing would quickly come to an amicable agreement, actually, that would serve both sides. China's not looking to invade the island and control, have total control, right? One country, two systems is still Beijing's approach. So I actually think this would be settled peacefully. And then, as far as our position in the Pacific, this, just because we want Taiwan to compromise, it does not mean that we are yielding the Pacific to China. Not in the least. We have real, actual treaty allies, namely the Philippines and Japan. Both of these giant island archipelagos are eminently defensible, and we can take a defense approach. Meaning they're in the lead, but we back them up in case they get invaded by China, which is a kind of ridiculous possibility. But I suppose, we should maintain these alliances, but we can take a much more relaxed approach, put a lot of resources toward other national priorities and not worry about this so much. China is not about to invade Japan or something like that. And I think, there's a more relaxed approach where we kind of live and let live with China. And work on tough problems together, like climate change and global development, things like that.
And Mr. Ambassador, let me end on this question here that Lyle brought up about our alliances in the area. This CNES stuff is talking about national decision-making stuff for the United States. To what extent do our regional allies in the Indo-Pacific, whether that's Australia, Japan, South Korea, et cetera, to what extent are they good or bad with the United States moving into this area where nuclear confrontation seems to be on the rise? Do they agree with that, or does it trouble them?
And they have always looked to the United States to manage this issue in a way that did not produce a war. Many of them are very disturbed by the drift of U.S. policy toward emphasizing purely military rather than diplomatic means of addressing the danger of war. Not a single one of them has made an official commitment to aid us in the event of a war with China over Taiwan. Some, like Japan, which has a very serious strategic interest in the status of Taiwan, might join us. They might be forced into it because we could not defend Taiwan without using bases in Japan. Japan has not said it would let us do that. But if we did, as Lyle indicated with Sasebo, Kadena, the air base in Okinawa, Sasebo, the submarine base, and other facilities in Japan would very likely be struck by the Chinese, and that could bring the Japanese into the war. We also have the Russian wild card. We have pushed Russia and China into an entente. As Lyle indicated, China has been very restrained in its approach to the Ukraine war. Would Russia be equally restrained in the event of a war that could destroy the Americans as a rival power by devastating our fleet and our air force? We don't know. We have the potential to set off something that is much wider and much more consequential. If the various scenarios that have been run, military war games that have been run, worked out the way some of them predict, we would end a war with China in a very, very weakened state. What would that do in terms of Russian approaches to us, or those of Iran, or those of other designated enemies of the United States? Would North Korea refrain from going south? Again, we don't know. This is not to be examined in a purely regional context, and it cannot be necessarily restricted. If we have a war, that war cannot necessarily be limited to the regional context.
And I keep going back to what Lyle had said earlier about the sustainment capacity. The United States has no possibility. We couldn't sustain one major war against any adversary, much less more. And it's troubling to me, to say the least, when we showed a couple of days ago a clip from David Petraeus, former CIA director, who said he do not count him in one of those that said we could not handle something in the Indo-Pacific, in the Middle East, and in the European continent simultaneously. He says there's no problem, but that is so divorced from reality. That's what troubles me about the prospect of us stumbling into something like what we're discussing here today. But
it is a bad approach to take.
It is. And listen, this is not a happy topic here, but really, really appreciate you guys bringing in extraordinary amounts of expertise into this so that we do know what the realities are. And hopefully some of this information here will at least sober up some of these people who think that we can go and do some of these actions with no consequence, can see that in a bad situation, it could be catastrophic, if not fatal, for our country. So thank you both for coming on today.
Thank you.
Thanks.
And we appreciate you guys coming on as well. Folks, listen, these are tough conversations, but you need to know the truth. And we need to get this out there so people understand what's at stake and that it's not necessary, that there are alternatives. There are ways that we can manage this to maintain stability, freedom of navigation, economic prosperity, and national security. All these things are possible with just taking an appetite suppressant. We'll see how that works out, but you can count on us to keep bringing it for you. Thank you very much. We'll see you on the next episode of Daniel Davis Deep Dive.